Shavua Tov. Today, I wanted to begin by talking a bit about the subject of free will, which is something that often comes up in discussions of skeptical philosophy when people are grappling with the question of moral responsibility, either while in confrontation with some idea of how the universe seems to work when we think of it through the lens of physics, or grappling with questions of what it means that we live in a world that's created and ruled by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or trying to look at the collision of all of those ideas together at once. And so I want to start by just talking about this in terms that you sometimes hear in what you might call philosophical discussions before we get into sources and think about whether there are some things in the Torah or in Tanakh that treat the subject. So if we think about free will from the standpoint of a skeptical philosopher who wants to create problems with the idea of free will from the standpoint of physics or something like that, the way the argument usually goes is something like this. Free will is when you yourself, as an individual, make choices about how you act for which you are responsible and over which you have control. And if that's supposed to be true, it is pointed out, then there's some kind of contradiction or problem that's raised by thinking about you as a being made of physical materials obeying physical laws, because you either can talk about physical materials obeying deterministic laws, in which case everything you do is some function of a bunch of initial conditions for the physical world that you didn't set, and therefore you couldn't be responsible for the deterministic outcome of a mechanism of which you're a mere part, because you didn't make the rules yourself and you didn't set the initial conditions yourself. Or you could go over to other kinds of physics and say, oh, there's all this randomness, there's all of this probabilism, there's all of these factors that are causing coins to be tossed, so to speak, and that's actually what's determining the things that you do. And again, you're not in control of the outcomes of the coin tosses, so how could you be responsible for the accumulation of the effects of a bunch of random events that you don't control? And so then, and this is, the kind of freshman seminar QED, where you've disproved moral responsibility and move on to another topic, you say, well, either the universe is deterministic or it's random or some mixture of the two, but it doesn't matter. In any case, because you are made of a bunch of materials that obey physical laws of some kind, the determinants of your actions lie outside of your control, and therefore it doesn't make sense to say that you're a being that has responsibility for how you act, and therefore perhaps we don't have real moral responsibility. And that's supposed to be some kind of grand finale to the argument, where afterwards we stroke our chins and think deep thoughts about how really science has demonstrated to us that there's no morality anymore. And you hear versions of this handed around by a variety of different sorts of sophists or would-be philosophers or what have you. But that's how the argument goes if we think of it in terms of physics. And then you hear another version of this argument where people try to engage with a theistic view. And they say, well, okay, you perhaps would like to say that you're not going to talk about the world in terms of natural laws that govern it. You're going to talk about the world in terms of its creator, right? An omniscient and omnipotent being, a creator of the sort described by the Hebrew Bible. If Kadosh Baruch Hu is king of everything and creator of everything, then he controls everything, he knows everything. And if that's the case, the same kind of argument gets made. How can you be responsible for what you do? Because if he's just writing the story for you, so to speak, then you are not responsible for what you did because he chose what you did for you. And then people try to resolve this with all of these kind of, I think, patches or sleights of hand or inadequate resolutions where they say, oh, well, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to have free will because he wants us to be responsible. And we accept the premise of the idea that in order to be responsible, we must have free will. And of course, Hashem wants us to be responsible because moral responsibility is the centerpiece of our relationship with him. And therefore, we know that since we have free will, that since we have responsibility, we must have free will. We simply stipulate that, oh, well, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us free will. And so, yes, he's king of everything, but he gives us free will. And we don't really dig into the question of what exactly it means then that he's giving us that choice. Like it starts to sound, if you scratch the surface there a little bit, like something is not totally resolved, because if we have choices that are free and come from us, does that mean he sort of drew a circle around us and said, all right, now I don't control this part? And does that mean he's not actually fully in control of the world and doesn't know certain things? Because the moment you get to that point, you say, oh, no, 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 of course he's in control, and of course he knows. But if so, then what does it mean for him to give us free will, right? So that's the kind of uh, tail chasing that happens on the theistic side of this kind of an argument. But the point is, whether you're coming from a sort of naturalistic or physical description, or whether you're trying to grapple with theistic aspects, when you come to the question of free will, as a Western philosopher who's trying to point out puzzles and contradictions and then kind of drop all the pieces and walk away and leave everyone feeling like their sense of moral responsibility is in a shambles, because that is the main goal, it would seem, of Enlightenment philosophy on down through the present. Uh, the when you start the argument that way, you come to certain conclusions, and the question is, where does this leave us if we're coming to it from the standpoint of Torah? Is there some kind of resolution of this if we're thinking of it and asking the question, well, how does Torah want us to think about this issue? And is there some way of not coming up with some confused contradiction where we end up feeling like we seem not to have real responsibility and it's all an illusion? And I think the main proposal that I would want to make there is that really all of these arguments, these philosophical arguments that people make about free will, where they try to attack the idea of moral responsibility like a good Western Enlightenment skeptic must do, what they are missing, or I don't want to say missing, I think it's a little more disingenuous than that. I think what they're hiding or concealing is that there's a shift that happens in the middle of that argument of perspective, from a perspective in which, by definition, there's no such thing as responsibility, to a perspective from within which there is such a thing as responsibility. And I think that we can leave aside the sort of physical law kind of argument for now, because I think that will be covered by eventually asking about what it means for the world to have physical laws if there's a God who created the world. So let's talk about the case where there's a God who created the world. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Borei Olam, the creator of the world. He's king of everything. He knows everything. He controls everything. He understands everything, etc. Right? We don't place any limitation on his knowledge or power or influence. And we get that all over the place from the text of our tradition. So if that's our starting point, now the question is, what does it mean as far as the matter of someone's responsibility if HaKadosh Baruch Hu had all of that power and knowledge? And I think the issue is that when people are setting up this argument as the skeptical philosopher, they're playing this shell game of what we mean by responsibility being something that should just be obvious, and we don't have to dig into it and talk about it in terms of, from whose perspective does that kind of a term really have meaning? And I think that maybe the easiest way of understanding what the issue is here is just to talk about a kind of everyday life example that is, I think, pretty easily relatable, where you start to see what it is that someone has hidden from you in these other arguments. Imagine that you're writing a story about characters in a fictional novel, right? So the characters go around in the world that you describe, and they have thoughts to themselves, and you write about those thoughts, and they do things, and you write about the things that they do. And maybe one character is named Reuven, and the other character is named Shimon. And Reuven, at some point in your story, gets angry at Shimon and picks up a rock and bashes in Shimon's head and kills him. So now you've written a story about a murder, right? And the question is, does Reuven have moral responsibility for what he did? And clearly, at one level, you're the author of the story, right? You control everything that happens in the story. You decided how to write the story. There's nothing about the story that's hidden from you. There's nothing about what happens in the story that's beyond you, because you're determining the content of it. And it's a unfettered expression of your will as the author of the story. But it doesn't really make sense to say, therefore, that Reuven is not responsible for murdering Shimon, because it's obvious, I think, in this example, that responsibility is a construct that exists within the story. Of course, authors are not responsible for the actions of the characters in their story in a way that somehow enters into the story and impinges on whether or not Reuven is responsible. The notion of responsibility is Reuven has thoughts, Reuven has intentions. Those are things that he's aware of. Those are things that he can talk to others about. And he takes actions that others can observe and that he has an account of as well. And when you take those kinds of factors together, those things that come from within the construct of the story, the definition of responsibility is something that is a function of those things within the story. It's a property of the characters in the story, and it's a property of the story. It is not something that disappears because the story has an author, right? Because you can write stories about people and they can act differently. And there could be a different story about Reuven and Shimon where instead Reuven is picking up a rock and he's standing on a cliff or something and he trips and accidentally drops the rock off a cliff and it falls on Shimon's head and kills him. And that's a different story than if Reuven got angry and hit him in the head deliberately. And it's obvious what the difference is in responsibility, again, with a proper definition of what responsibility means, by a function of what we can write in the story about people's thoughts and their intentions and the actions that they took and the results of them. So this game that people play in the kind of theistic argument against moral responsibility, or let's say against the existence of free will and therefore against moral responsibility, where they say, well, if God is omniscient and all and omnipotent, then he determined everything, including what you did, which means you're not responsible for determining what you did, and therefore you can't be responsible, and also you don't have free will. That's a distortion or a perversion of the meaning of free will. What free will means is, again, a construct within the story that from the perspective of the one acting, he knows things about his intentions. He can talk about things about his intentions if interviewed. And he knows things about the actions that he takes, and other people know things about the actions that he takes. And those are the kinds of factors out of which we construct the idea that there's such a thing as my will and things that I intended, and then there's the actions that I took, and there's how correlated were the actions that I took with the will that I had, which I could express in words if I wanted, and how correlated are the results of what happened with what I imagined to be the results that I wanted to prove out when I took certain actions, right? All of those things are things that could be studied by interviewing people who are characters within the story, but they are factors that are within the construct of the story. And the question of whether someone has a will and whether that will expresses itself in action, all of that has to do with things happening amongst and between and inside the characters of the story. Even if the author is writing the story and saying Reuven was angry at Shimon, or Reuven accidentally let go of the rock, right? Whether the author writes one of those things or another thing changes whether Reuven's responsible in the story, but the fact that there's an author of the story does not alter Reuven's responsibility in the story. It's a silly thing to say, well, Reuven's just a character in a story, so he's not responsible for anything. That's a distortion or a perversion, as I said. This is a story about a character who is responsible for his actions. That is the way responsibility and free will have clear meaning. And anything else is this bait and switch where you say, aha, because the story has an author, therefore the apparent free will leading to action of the character in the story is in fact an illusion. Now, that is kind of a simple parable, let's say, that is not quite as complex as the situation that we have if we talk now theologically from the perspective of Tanakh. What's the situation that we face with HaKadosh Baruch Hu being Borei Olam, the creator of the world? And I think the point is there that it's just a bit more complicated, because why? Because yes, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the author of the story. Right? There's no other way of saying about Hashem that he really has unlimited knowledge and power, like knowledge of and power over the world, unless you give him that free and unfettered authorship, right? Where everything that is and everything that happens is within his grasp and is an expression of his will. Like the moment you step back from that complete and total description and you say, well, this stuff is an expression of his will, but this other thing I'm not so sure. If it's not an expression of his will, then what is it, right? You've graduated to dualism. You've now said there's more than one God in some sense. There's some power, there's some factor that is not HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that is determining something, and it's beyond his reach to control or influence or know or whatever you want to say. There's a serious problem with that. We can't go that direction. So if we can't go that direction, then he is the author. But why is this a different story than usual? Normally, you pick up a novel, you read it, and it's all about the characters in the story. Right? The author wrote the story, but what you read about is the people within the construct of the story. So the author might have been living in Wisconsin in 1950, and the story might take place in Egypt 3,000 years ago, right? And near the twain shall meet. One has nothing to do with the other than that actually, that the book was written by a person in Wisconsin. What's different about the story, so to speak, of the reality that we experience is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu insists not only on being the author, but also making himself a character in the story, right? He wants the characters in his story to be aware of his authorship, and he wants them to seek dialogue with him, and he's going to write into their actions different varying degrees of success and failure in seeking relationship with him. And he's also going to write into the story different ways that he tries to put into the world messages that give his characters a chance to hear from him what he has to say to them, right? And why he's writing that story is not our business at some level, or at least this is not something we should treat as an easy question to answer where it should be obvious, right? That's the part where I would say it might be that remains beyond our comprehension forever. It might be that that's in the realm of his unattainable kedusha, his separate and special and different nature, because he's separate and special and different from everything else that is by virtue of his oneness. And so if it's the case that when we look at it this way, as a story that's being written, it sounds a bit odd at first, because you say, if he's really writing the whole story, why does he do that? Why is that important to him? What's the difference for him between writing the story and not writing the story? what would there be if he didn't write the story? We have no idea. If he does write the story, now the question is, what does he get out of it? Why would he care, in a sense, if he's the author and he has total control, total artistic control, so to speak, from start to finish? Then what is it worth to him that the story's written this way and not that way? And that is something I don't think we should rush to assume it should be obvious how to figure out the answer to that question. But what I think we do start to get a sense of is that there at least is some notion of complexity now to understanding how such a story has to unfold. Because if HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants, on the one hand, to write the story with total artistic control, so to speak, but also to make himself a participant in dialogues within that same construct, then he's going to demonstrate his judgment of his own characters through the way he writes about what happens to them as they talk to him, right? There's a sense in which it's possible for him to write a piece of the story and say, I'm going to tell the character that I want him to do a certain thing. Maybe it's Hashem talking to Avraham and saying, all right, go take Yitzchak and sacrifice him on Har Moriah, right? The binding of Isaac. And then Avraham goes off and does something. And at one level, when he's doing that, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is writing the story, right? He's saying, okay, then Avraham went over here. And then there's this dialogue between Avraham and Yitzchak, right? From the perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, outside of the construct of the story, it's all up to him, right? And that's how he wanted to write it. The same way he wants to write the Torah a certain way, he wants to write the world a certain way. And we don't get around that ever. However, the point is that the way that he writes it creates the possibility of relationship for the character, from the character's perspective, with him, right? It's still possible, since he is a speaking character in the story as well, right? He communicates with the character of the story. So from the perspective of the character, going into the construct of the story, where, as we said before, it's within the construct of the story that we have choice, that we have intention, that we have a will of our own, that we make choices that express some desire or motivation. We take action, and then we produce consequences, right? From within the story, the character in the story can have a will, can make choices, can see what happens, and can experience the world in such a way that it becomes possible through the events in that world to have a relationship with the author, especially because the author has actually written into the story that he has every so often very explicit things he has to say, right? Because he gave us a book that we can read that tells a lot of things about what he has to say. And we also maybe can see in the events of our life that he writes into every little thing that happens to us, some ways he wants to make signs to us that he's watching and he's involved and he cares about what we do, right? So it's a marvelous construct when viewed in this way, because we don't usually write stories about people this way. We don't write books this way where we say, well, I'm the author and I want to be involved. I want to write about characters developing a relationship with me, and I'm gonna show them things in their life that are going to help them on a path. And I'm going to understand something about the path that they're on. It would be very difficult, actually, to write a story like that was any good, because you need to understand something about what it's like to engage in that kind of dialogue while also being outside of it all and having this total control. But if you think of HaKadosh Baruch Hu as being in that situation in his relationship to the created world, then I don't think there's really any remaining issue in what we call the paradox of free will and moral responsibility or free will and determinism, or all these different versions of it. And there's nothing that's touched by any issue in physics or in natural laws or whatever that we now would introduce. Because, of course, if he's writing the story, he's perfectly welcome to write a story and perfectly free to write a story that is about a world that has things like gravity in it, and it has things like sunlight in it and whatever else. Because he wants his story to take place in a world that has predictability in it. Because it turns out actually there's no real possibility of meaning in a world that isn't partly predictable. So he's going to introduce the subject of whatever is happening in a setting where there are things that tend to happen a certain way, usually, like apples tend to fall off of trees, etc. And there's no additional problem created for us philosophically by the fact that now there are natural laws tending to govern what seems to usually happen in this story world, right? Anything that we can deal with once we have dealt with the issue of HaKadosh Baruch Hu being in charge, it doesn't become more or less complicated when we additionally try to look at it through the lens of what we were saying, the sort of more naturalistic way people try to make the argument. That's in a sense a special case where HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants his story world to have some seemingly reliable natural laws in it. That's actually pretty necessary. It's pretty hard to imagine a world that doesn't have that has an interesting story in it. But it doesn't change his freedom to write any part of it differently than the laws might have dictated if he so chooses. So I think that if we've dealt with the construct from the standpoint of what if Hashem is in control of everything, we've really dealt with every possibility. And so we're just talking now about a situation where we don't worry anymore that free will is some kind of thorny problem because we properly understand it to be a word that only has meaning for within the construct of a story where there are people with perspectives that allow them to give testimony about their own will and intention, and that allow them to have the experience of seeing their actions correlate with that will. There's no meaning to free will other than that. And there's obviously no damage done to the idea of moral responsibility within the construct of the story simply by observing that there's an author outside the story who's decided how to write it. And so for anyone who wants to say, oh yeah, free will and moral responsibility are an illusion because there's laws of physics or because there's a God controlling everything, they need to recognize that they're beginning the conversation essentially by doing some kind of logical equivalent of assuming 2 equals 3 and then basing everything else on top of that. Like they've started off with a bit of logical nonsense that they've hidden in a sort of sleight of hand of switching perspectives and changing the definition of a term midstream. And if we can just avoid that kind of sophistical smoke and mirrors game at the beginning, then we don't really have a problem with free will going forward. And the question instead just becomes, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is writing the story in this way where he's also seeking relationship, what are we supposed to do? And how do we make decisions about how to do that? And yes, he's the one, so to speak, perhaps writing the story, and he knows how we're going to decide what to do. And he chose that so that the story would tell a certain tale and make a certain point. But from our perspective, we don't know how the story plays out. And which character we are in the story is for us to choose, the same way when an author writes a novel, it's a choice for the character to make before he makes it. And that doesn't diminish the meaning of it or the significance of it, but rather it just roots that meaning and that significance within the perspective of the human being. And I think to close off the point, speaking in philosophical terms, this lines up, I think, most neatly with observations made by Rav Joseph P. Soloveitchik in his analysis of the Garden of Eden, because I believe in his famous work, The Lonely Man of Faith, because at the end of the day, part of the point of the fact that there are these 2 creation stories, one of which is very, the 7 days, and seems very much to emphasize the speech and the perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the other one, which is about the human beings in the Garden of Eden, I'm maybe making an error, and it may have been Rav Jonathan Sachs, perhaps commenting on the holy man of faith who made this point, or it might have been originally Rav Soloveitchik himself. But in any case, the idea is that we can't do without at least two perspectives, right? When the Torah talks about the truth that it has to tell us, it will not simply speak to us from this perspective of the Creator, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, nor will it simply emphasize the perspective of the human being, but rather it insists on telling about creation twice because it has to tell us about both perspectives, because we are missing something if we only have one. And I think that notion in the Torah that you cannot express the whole truth without more than one perspective is a very deep and profound one across the whole Torah. And at some level, the desire to boil everything down to one perspective, I would say, is an aesthetic fetish of Western philosophy and Greek philosophy that provides the motivation for this kind of shell game we were talking about, with changing the definition of free will midstream in order to create this apparent paradox. Because the idea is that it's the refusal to accept a truth that requires at least two perspectives, the insistence that the truth must come from the one perspective that sees all that is true. That very kind of Hellenic idea, and that which goes down through Christianity into Enlightenment philosophy, is what is creating this problem for us. So I don't even want to necessarily say that it's like, when I was saying it's a shell game, it's like it's suggesting it's all a charade and someone's just trying to trick you. There are clearly people who sincerely believe that this is a philosophical problem. But the reason they do is because of the incorrect insistence of Hellenic and Western Enlightenment philosophy on the elimination of all perspectives but one, when you have arrived at the final truth. And the Torah fundamentally rejects that and would say, no, you need at least two perspectives. And so, from the perspective of the human being, there is free will because we're characters in the story. And clearly, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's perspective, there is no such thing as our freely chosen will because he's writing the story. But also from his perspective, there's no such thing as the responsibility that we have, because we don't have responsibility out in his world or from his perspective. That responsibility is a thing that exists within the construct of our perspective in our world. And he's very interested in that story and in the possibility of responsibility in the story that he's writing.
What would you make of the that piece in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, which seemingly describes the impossibility of understanding it being a conundrum?
I'm not sure I know which piece of Pirkei Avot you're referring to. If you want to try to dig it up, I have some other sources that I think are relevant to this, that I can quote in somewhat random order. There's a pasuk in Mishle, book of Proverbs, that I think is, or a set of psukim actually. This is in Perek Tet Zayin, pasuk Tet, so chapter 16, verse 9. Lev Adam Yechashev Darko ve'Adonai Yachin Tza'ado. A man's heart devises his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Tesem al siftei melech v'mishpat lo yima'al piu. A divine sentence is in the lips of the king. His mouth does not transgress in judgment. Peles u me'oznei mishpat la'Adonai ma'asehu kol avnei chis. A just weight and scale are the Lord's, all the weights in the bag are his work. You have this kind of repetition of a theme that it's sort of jumping between the perspective of the things that happen in the world, and then also at the same time some sense in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu is standing outside and is in control of all of it. And actually this word kesem, it was translated as a divine sentence, but really kesem is magic, and it's magic like of a sort of augury sort. And I find it interesting because it's also mentioned in a passage in Sefer Yechezkel, the book of Ezekiel, where there's this moment where Nebuchadnezzar is going to come and destroy Jerusalem, but he's trying to decide what to do using the pagan augury of his time. So it's Ki amad melech Bavel el em haderech berosh shnei hadrachim b'qasam qasem kilkal b'chitzim she'al b'dhafim ra'a b'kaved. For the king of Babylon stood at the parting of the way, at the head of the two ways, to use divination. He shook the arrows, he consulted the terafim, he looked in the liver. בימינו היה פסם ירושלים לשום כרים, לפתוח פה ברצח, להרים כל בתרועם לשום כרים על שערים, לשפוך סוללה, לבנות דייק. At his right hand was the divination for Jerusalem, to set battering rams, to open the mouth for slaughter, to lift up the voice for shouting. So there's this sense of he's trying to decide which way to go. And the reason I think this is such a significant example is because of what else we know narratively in the plot as a whole, which is that Nebuchadnezzar is going to go and destroy the Temple of Jerusalem. And the whole book of, it's not even just Yechezkel, it's, a series of books throughout Nevi'im, Yirmiyahu and Yeshayahu and Sefer Melachim also, right? They're all telling us in their way about why the temple is going to be destroyed, and emphasizing the idea that it is because of the sins of the people that HaKadosh Baruch Hu ultimately decides to destroy his own house. And Nebuchadnezzar is the one he's going to task to destroy his house. But the point is that it's not because he comes to Nebuchadnezzar and says, Nebuchadnezzar, you are a tzaddik, and you are a righteous prophet, and I command you to go destroy my house in Jerusalem. It's that Nebuchadnezzar is a tool in his hand. And Nebuchadnezzar thinks he's using some kind of magical augury to decide what to do. But really, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was in control the whole time of what his augury is going to tell him to do. And he's going to use Nebuchadnezzar. And afterwards, in Sefer Daniel, you get to see Nebuchadnezzar fall, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu isn't actually happy with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is a wicked king who destroyed and tormented and slaughtered the people of Hashem, and he has to now go onto the ash heap of history himself afterwards for his sins. And there is no problem with the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu both chose for Nebuchadnezzar to make this mistake and then punishes him for the mistake, because there is, at the end of the day, a construct of the choice being made within the tale that's being spun, so to speak, and then there's HaKadosh Baruch Hu's grand plan for how it all fits together on the outside. And the problem we always have is when we try to generate some kind of full coherence or union between these two perspectives. So it is the case that maybe HaKadosh Baruch Hu kind of has to deal with us with such great rachamim, because he's acknowledging at some level that he is the one who's deciding how we act when we make mistakes, and he bears some of the responsibility for it. And so, we learn about him elsewhere in the Torah that has 13, attributes of mercy, and maybe some element of that mercy is coming from the kind of the willingness on his part to accept a little bit of the blame for our mistakes. But at the end of the day, really, he's writing a story about people who make mistakes, and he's expressing his judgments of those mistakes through what happens to them in the story.
Yeah. I keep on thinking to myself, is it possible within the realm, the framework of Judaism, to try to make the claim that Hashem, being the all-powerful, this goes, similar to the sort of in the direction of the question of can Hashem create a rock that he can't lift? But that is obviously impossible because he would always be able to override even if theoretically he were going to do that, he would always be able to override it, so he really can't. But he would, in the end, he would be able to lift the rock, whatever
Well,
that rock might be. But no,
I,
I'm
I,
asking myself whether it's possible that Hashem could create free will by engaging in some type of self-restricting act. Somehow, I don't know if the right word, this is similar to the concept of tzimtzum. Maybe that it is.
well,
Uh,
but see, Tzimtzum is a Kabbalistic concept, right? And I think it's not an accident that it's a Kabbalistic concept because Kabbalah is exactly the kind of mystical overlay on top of Torah that feels the need to invent a kind of magical realm of ghosts and spirits in which there is a metaphysical resolution of this paradox that has no explanation, right? Where it just says, Tzimtzum happens, and now we have free will over here in this box because Hashem can make it there. And for me, I don't see that as Torah so much as an attempt by the Kabbalists to, in a sense, participate in this philosophical confusion that we're trying to step clear of, and propose a mystical solution, which is no solution at all, unless you want to believe in the mystical emanations. But to me, I think what's a more coherent position that I think seems more rooted in what we're told about HaKadosh Baruch Hu from the authoritative sources is simply to say that it is not an issue of, well, he can create whatever he wants, so he can create things that are paradoxical. So even though we can argue to ourselves that our having free will when he's in control of everything is a paradox, he can just make it be the case that both things are true. I think that way lies danger because he doesn't need to do things to solve problems in our understanding. Like there's no reason. What you have to notice there is that in that kind of an argument, the supposed way that he's using his unlimited power to create something that seems paradoxical, that would only be something that he'd be doing because of a deficiency of ours in understanding something. It wouldn't be actually resolving a problem for him. And so it doesn't, first of all, in that sense, even seem like a necessary thing on his part. But also, I think more to the point, there's a much easier resolution of all of that kind of thing, which is to say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't, he's not a magician who's trying to entertain us. So he's not going to say, for my next trick, I'll make a rock that I can't lift and show you how powerful I am. He has to have a reason that is good in his eyes to do anything, right? And he's not going to do anything that's not, he doesn't have good reason to do in his eyes. So if we see the world working a certain way, we can take from that the lesson that this is an indication of a preference of his, right? And I think I've liked best seeing this point, not talking about free will, but something maybe slightly related, which I believe I heard made first by Rabbi David Foreman, which is if you look in the work of creation, the 7 days of creation, one of the tendencies you see is for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to want to outsource and sort of fire himself, to get out of the way. Like he doesn't just make trees with fruits, he makes trees with fruits that make seeds so that they can make more trees that have fruits and seeds, right? He sets in motion things that can produce sustained consequences on their own. And obviously from a biological perspective, when we look at the world, that makes sense because we think of biological life as coming from a chain of progenitors. And so you need the life that exists currently to be capable of producing seeds because its ancestors were capable of producing seeds. But when you read it through the way the 7 days of creation are described, that what the Torah is kind of emphasizing is this is all an expression of the Ratzon of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And one of the things that part of his Ratzon is that he doesn't want to just make fruit in a pile somewhere. He wants to make a process in the world that he can let act as it normally tends to act, and it will, to a significant degree, fill the world with other trees that have fruits in them because it will produce seeds that will produce more trees that will produce more fruits. And I think we also see something like this in Megillat Esther, where if we think of Achashverosh as a kind of allegory for a true, all-powerful king, obviously Achashverosh is a problematic character. He's not, one would never want to say that he is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, chas v'chalila, but his behavior demonstrates to us what true kingship is to some degree. And we can learn things about the kingship of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that way. So there's all this writing of orders and sending orders to different minions of his. And then, he refuses to rescind the orders to destroy the Jews, but he says, I'll send other orders saying that they can defend themselves. So you have a bit of this sense of a king who wants his kingdom to be ruled by law is going to be reluctant to rescind his laws or to break them, because if he does that all the time, that will be a choice about what those laws are, right? Are they really hard and fast laws, or are they unpredictable, unreliable, and therefore not really laws? And so I think you can always play the same game and say, oh, but couldn't Kadosh Baruch Hu, if he wanted to make a law that was as strong as any and yet was also constantly being broken because he's that powerful and unlimited? And I think that we're not really talking about his power there. We're talking about the limitations of our ability in language, right? Like we can imagine somehow that, well, can't HaKadosh Baruch Hu make 2 = 3 if he wants to, but really, for that to be true, like what we're really talking about here is something that has no meaning in language that we've made up. So we don't even know what we're saying that he's doing. And so I think it's a useless kind of scenario to talk about. So I think rather than go the route of saying he's making rocks he can't pick up, I think it's more like he has preferences for how he writes the story. And he wants the story to be about people who experience the world as though they have this will and that they act on this will. And he also, in general, likes to write the world in such a way that he seems to be kind of getting out of the way and letting things happen according to their natural course much of the time. That's his clear preference, both from our experience in the world that we actually live in, and also, when we read the Torah. It's not the case that every foot that drops, as HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, actively, I will use my yad chazakah, my strong hand, to make your foot step that way. But I think what this goes to at the end of the day is, I mentioned the yad chazakah. When you think about Yetziat Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt, what is the difference between doing this in the background or in the foreground? That's one of the main points of Yetziat Mitzrayim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always the author, right? He's Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. He identifies himself as I will be what I will be. Everything comes from him, right? Everything that happens is an expression of his will. But it is not the case that everything that happens is an equally obvious and revealed expression of his will, right? The author chooses everything, but when Mitzrayim is struck with plagues, that's supposed to be the Yad Chazakah, the Zora Neturiyah, the strong hand, the outstretched arm. That's HaKadosh Baruch Hu showing everyone, that the creator of the world is reaching into the story and causing crazy calamities to happen that reveal his will unambiguously. Because Moshe says, I am from Hashem, I represent him, I'm his emissary. He's going to do this thing tomorrow at this time, and then it happens, right? So, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is no less in control of the story when they go down to Mitzrayim and become slaves there, but he doesn't do that biyad chazakah. He does that in this capacity of where he actually it's quite the opposite. He identifies himself to Yaakov Avinu as El Shaddai, and there's an emphasis on shepherding there. This is actually something also that I think came through some of the Shiurim and Aleph Beta Rabbi David Forbin. This idea of the shepherd standing behind the flock, and the flock kind of walks as it thinks it needs to, but the shepherd is sort of nudging things from the back and getting enough information about how the flock should go as a whole to guide the flock, but is standing behind the flock. And that's the sort of mode of hitalech lefanai, you go out before me, like what HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Avram, to Yaakov. And that's very different than Hashem showing everyone that his hand is grabbing onto something and dragging it around. And it is not less the case that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is involved in choosing everything when he's at the back of the flock, but it is true that it is less overt. And the overtness is the essence of what happens in Yetziat Mitzrayim.